Dahmer's mental state at the time of the first-degree intentional homicide of Curtis Straughter, that is, on February 17, 1991?
Well, I didn't evaluate it on that day, of course, but I did evaluate his mental state on that day.
As of that day, right? Would you share with the jury your findings with respect to whether Mr. Dahmer appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed Curtis Straughter?
The evidence bearing on that question in this case is the same as it is with all of the others. That is, that he ensured that there were no witnesses to the killing, that he told me that he in fact appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct at the time of all of the killings, and the steps that he took to avoid detection, disposing of most of the remains of Mr. Straughter. In addition, Mr. Dahmer told me about one incident that occurred. Apparently, by coincidence, there was another murder in the same apartment building around this time, shortly after he killed Mr. Straughter, and that caused Mr. Dahmer to fear that something had been discovered about his own activities, and he expressed relief when a detective investigating this unrelated homicide had come to his apartment, briefly looked around, but not discovered any of the evidence. And so that is an indication of his appreciation of the wrongfulness of his conduct, that he feared detection.
As a result of your observation and your findings, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether or not Mr. Dahmer appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed Curtis Straughter?
Yes, based on all of the evidence, I reached the opinion with reasonable medical certainty that at the time Mr. Dahmer killed Curtis Straughter, he possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct.
Would you share with the jury your findings as to whether Jeffrey Dahmer possessed or lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time that he slayed Curtis Straughter?
Yes, and in addition to the evidence that's true for most or all of the cases, such as drinking alcohol to decrease his inhibitions and taking these elaborate steps to be alone with the victim, there were some particular preparations that Mr. Dahmer made prior to this killing. Namely, it was before this killing that he purchased a black nylon strap from a hardware store for use in strangling victims. And it was in advance of this particular killing that he purchased a pair of handcuffs from an Army surplus store. And he used the handcuffs to restrain Mr. Straughter and used the black strap to strangle him. As he described it to me, quote, "He was gay and he wanted anal sex, so I made the drink mixture. He fell asleep, used the handcuffs. This was the first time I used handcuffs. Strangled him, took pictures." End quote. So that description indicates that at the time of this homicide, he was not behaving impulsively, but rather was engaging in planful action, in addition to the motives characteristic of the majority of the killings. In this case, he had the additional motive of avoiding anal receptive activity that this victim had desired. The planned nature of the activity, the preparations of buying supplies in advance of the activity, incapacitating the victim with handcuffs while drugged and before killing him, are all indications that this is not an impulsive activity, but rather a planned and a more careful activity. And of course here, as with all of the charged homicides, there's no indication at all of Mr. Dahmer desiring to kill the people or feeling any compulsion to kill them. On the contrary, he wished various kinds of sexual activity and found the killing an unnecessary, an unpleasant, but sometimes necessary task.
Keeping in mind your observations and your findings with respect to this particular slaying, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether or not Jeffrey Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time that he killed Curtis Straughter?
Yes, I did.
And what is that opinion?
In my opinion, at the time that Jeffrey Dahmer killed Curtis Straughter, he possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law.
And is that opinion within a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes, it is.
Did you evaluate Jeffrey Dahmer's mental state as of the time that he killed Lindsay Earl, first-degree intentional homicide, Earl Lindsay, as of the 7th of April, 1991?
Yes, I did.
Would you share with the jury your findings with respect to whether Mr. Dahmer appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed Errol Lindsay?
Well, in this instance, in addition to all of the general evidence that's true for each of the homicides, there is a change in Mr. Dahmer's technique that's informative about whether or not he appreciated wrongfulness. And that is, this is the first of the instances in which he drilled a hole into his victim's skull. And here, Mr. Dahmer reported that he first drugged Mr. Lindsay and thereafter used what he described as the drilling technique on the top of his skull. And we discussed this in some detail. In the course of that discussion, he said that after initially having drilled the hole and injected I would call it a syringe, it's a baster actually, a syringe full of muriatic acid into the cranial cavity of Mr. Lindsay, that Mr. Lindsay woke up, and when he regained consciousness, Mr. Dahmer said he was groggy when he woke up, but still coherent and aware of his surroundings. And so I figured it was a failure. Gave him more sleeping pills, he fell asleep, then I strangled him. That indicates not only that the behavior was not impulsive, considering the planning and the various activities that went into this, including buying the baster to use, but it also is an indication that there was no compulsion to kill, because what Mr. Dahmer wanted here was the compliant sex partner, the zombie as he described it, rather than to have a corpse. It was his intention to keep this man alive if that was going to work, but when he concluded that he had failed to achieve the compliant partner with no will, only then did he strangle him. So what's another way to look at it is that when he couldn't have the zombie-like creation he was hoping for, he was willing to settle for a corpse, and the strangulation is a means to that end, and of course to avoid the problem that would result if he were to call an ambulance at that time, or to send the man home, or to take him somewhere where he might be able to retain memory of what happened and identify his assailant. We discussed in further detail what he had in mind here, and in that discussion, he told me that when Mr. Lindsay had regained consciousness, he said, "What time is it?" and was complaining of a headache, obviously, but he wasn't in a zombie-like state as I had desired. I asked him in that discussion the question, "You didn't expect him to wake up and say, 'Yes, master'?" And he said, no, but that was the general idea, that pliability of the will. I asked him what his model was for that. And he said, "I didn't have any model. It was a hit or miss experimentation." Shortly thereafter, I asked where he got the idea that he might be able to knock out the resistance center or the will while keeping the other mental faculties intact, because that was a theory of some philosophers and physicians a century ago that might be possible. And he said, well, I knew the intelligence was supposed to be seated in the frontal lobe, so that's where I directed the injection. He said, but I didn't know exactly what would happen. It never did work. I asked him if he had heard of frontal lobotomies, a kind of surgical procedure, and he said that he had. And I asked if that's what he was doing there, and he said it was. Later, in that same conversation, he said, quote, I was just trying to disable the will. And I asked, and subject them to your will? And he said, right.
Just read the last part of that document. Very last thing you said.
The question, and subject them to your will? And
Do you recall, Doctor, whether he had indicated at any time that he had done any reading or read anything on that subject, if you recollect?
Well, I sought to engage him in a conversation about Hollywood movies about zombies, or whether he'd read about the voodoo rituals about zombies. And I believe he said that all that he'd been exposed to was the Hollywood versions from movies. I'm sorry, I forget which question we were on, whether it was wrongfulness or conduct.
You were considering the wrongfulness aspect of it, of his conduct with respect to Mr. Straughter.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Lindsay, forgive me.
Mr. Dahmer also told me that he had, in this instance, used a small paring knife to try to remove the skin from Mr. Lindsay. And I asked him where he placed him while he did that, and he said on the bedroom floor. I said, on top of what? And he said, a plastic sheet. I said, to prevent, and he responded, prevent leakage of blood. And I said, and staining the floor? And he said, mm-hmm. I asked if there were carpeting there, and he said there was. And I asked these questions in part because I'd seen a photograph of that victim on a plastic sheet and that Mr. Dahmer had taken, and also because I knew that there'd been carpet cleaners brought in to whom he gave some other explanation. That is, he didn't volunteer that it was human blood. Those efforts to prevent blood stains on the carpet and the use of a plastic sheet to do it, I see as evidence of appreciating the wrongfulness of his conduct.
Keeping in mind the observations you made of him, and particularly your findings in this regard, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether the defendant, Mr. Dahmer, had substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct at the time that he killed Errol Lindsay?
Yes, I did.
And what is that opinion?
In my opinion, at the time that Mr. Dahmer killed Errol Lindsay, he possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct, and this is an opinion with reasonable medical certainty.
Would you share with the jury your findings as to whether Jeffrey Dahmer possessed or lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time that he slayed Errol Lindsay?
In addition to the facts that are true for each of the cases, there are the facts that I just described about settling for a corpse instead of the compliant zombie-like sexual partner he'd hoped for. The fact that Mr. Dahmer was attempting to obtain this living but compliant partner indicates that there was no compulsion to kill, but rather a desire to have a sexual partner of a particular type. In fact, a living type would have been preferable. Also, as I described earlier, his statements that what he was attempting to do was to destroy the will of the other person and subject that person to his will is an indication that at the time of doing this, he had a will. That is, he had the capacity to make decisions and control his behavior. What he sought to do was to take that capacity away from someone else. It was also in this case that I asked the more general question while we were discussing this case, would you be drinking while you dismembered them? And he said, oh yeah, sure, yeah. I said, why? And he replied, I was thirsty. That made it easier, the alcohol. I asked, why'd you need that help? And he responded, it just made it easier to do the job. I asked, which was an unattractive job? And he replied, hard work. Yeah, it was. I asked, was it hard work or was it repulsive to do this? And he said both. And that's an indication that the behavior during the dismemberment was not impulsive behavior and not compulsive behavior, and that he had no drive or desire to do the dismembering, although there were parts of it that were useful to him, such as being able to see the viscera and mementos he would keep. In general, the dismemberment was for the purpose of disposing of evidence of his crimes.
As a result of those observations and your findings, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Jeffrey Dahmer possessed possessed or lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time that he slayed Earl Lindsay?
Yes.
And what is that opinion?
In my opinion, with reasonable medical certainty, at the time of killing Earl Lindsay, Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law.
Did there come a time that you evaluated, strike that, did you evaluate Jeffrey Dahmer's mental state at the time that he slayed Tony Hughes That is on or about May 24, 1991.
Yes, I did.
Would you share with the jury your findings with respect to whether Mr. Dahmer appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed Tony Hughes?
Here the evidence is as it is with the cases generally of having brought the victim to a private location, of having taken steps to avoid detection, particularly dismembering and disposing of the remains. Though in this case he did not dismember and dispose of the remains immediately, but rather not until after he had killed yet another victim. There was a short delay here because that other victim was killed 3 days later. And ordinarily, Mr. Dahmer, if he could, would spend 2 or 3 days with the victim intact so that he could enjoy them sexually during that period. And of course, there's Mr. Dahmer's more general statement that he appreciated the wrongfulness at the time of each of these killings.
Was this also done again within the confines of his private premises, the slaying of Tony Hughes?
Yes.
As a result of your observations and these particular findings, did you form an opinion within a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Dahmer appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct, or had the capacity, substantial capacity, to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct when he slayed Tony Hughes?
Yes, based on all of the evidence, it's my opinion with reasonable medical certainty that at the time of killing Mr. Hughes, Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct.
Would you share with the jury your findings as to whether Jeffrey Dahmer possessed or lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time of the slaying of Tony Hughes?
Yes. Here, in addition to the more general points that are true in all or nearly all the cases, there's one very specific point, namely that in this instance, Mr. Dahmer didn't try to kill Tony Hughes, but rather Mr. Hughes died through the foreseeable but unintended consequence of this drilling technique. He drilled a hole into his skull and poured in acid, and Mr. Hughes died then, even though it was Mr. Dahmer's intention to keep him alive in this altered state. And so there's no compulsion here to kill. He'd rather he not have died. And it was not any impulsive act of killing, but rather a planful act of trying to provide himself with a compliant sexual partner.
As a result of your general observations of the matter and with respect to your particular findings on in this case, did you form an opinion within a reasonable degree of professional certainty as to whether Mr. Dahmer, at the time he slayed Tony Hughes, possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law?
In my opinion, with reasonable medical certainty, at the time of killing Mr. Hughes, Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law.
Did you evaluate Jeffrey Dahmer's mental state as of the time that he slayed or engaged in the first-degree intentional homicide of Conorak Synthesymphone, that is on May 27, 1991?
Yes, I did.
Would you share with the jury your findings with respect to whether Mr. Dahmer possessed the substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed Conorak Synthesymphone?
Here, in addition to the more general evidence characteristic of all 15 of the charged killings, there's also evidence that emerges from the specific events that transpired when Mr. Synthesymphone walked out of the apartment and was encountered by all of the citizens and by law enforcement people and fire department personnel. And in that instance, Mr. Dahmer communicated to police in the presence of other witnesses in a manner indicating that Mr. Dahmer appreciated the wrongfulness of the conduct he had engaged in with that victim to that point, namely by giving a false name for the victim and misleading police as to the nature of their relationship so as to be able to retain custody, as it were, of this victim and have the police go away. And he was able, of course, to behave in such a manner that the police believed him. With respect to whether he appreciated the wrongfulness, not only does his misleading the police in order to try to evade detection here show an appreciation of wrongfulness, but also his telling them an untrue story instead of the true story is such an indication. The true story would have been, yes, I know this man, I've been making a zombie of him by drilling a hole in his brain. And that's a story he didn't tell. And he didn't tell that because he knew that that was not going to preserve his freedom best. But rather he gave them a story about this being a friend who does such things when he drinks too much, which proved to be a successful cover story for the moment. And his thinking on his feet to create that cover story and to evade detection even when the victim has just wandered out onto the street is an indication of his appreciation of the wrongfulness that comes right in the midst of the activity that brought about this young man's death.
Doctor, did he tell you whether or not he had engaged in the drilling enterprise before he left and went to the tavern?
Yes.
On that occasion, then he went to the tavern and then sighted Conrad Synthesis phone naked on the street. Is that correct?
Exactly.
All right. So, I know you are a psychiatrist and not a pathologist, but did he indicate to you what type of an injection he used, what the quantity was that he injected after the drilling technique?
Before Mr. Synthesis phone walked out, he
Yes.
had injected, I believe, an entire syringe full of this muriatic acid into the brain.
Would that,
cavity.
do you know or can you advise the jury as to what effect that would have with respect to whether there would be bleeding? What effect that acid might have on the potential for that head to be bleeding?
I can't offer an expert opinion on that.
In terms of the size of the drill bit, was there any discussion about that?
Yes.
Either in this or the earlier events?
Yes.
I think you had discussed that. Was it a very small or large? Can you share that with the jury?
I tried to determine the size by asking if it was the size of a 20-gauge needle, and we didn't share an understanding of what size that was, nor did we could we identify a drill bit size that would properly describe it. However, Mr. Dahmer said that the portion that went from the syringe into the brain cavity was about the size of the cartridge of an ordinary ballpoint pen. And so I believe that to be a very small hole.
That would be the cartridge, the narrow, often plastic that contains the ink within a ballpoint pen?
Yes.
Right. As a result of your discussions with Mr. Dahmer with respect to that incident, your observations, did you form an opinion within a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether or not, at the time of the slaying of Conrad Synthesis phone, Jeffrey Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct?
Based on all of the information available to me, it's my opinion with reasonable medical certainty that at the time of killing Conrad Synthesis phone, Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct.
Would you share with the jury your findings as to whether Jeffrey Dahmer possessed or lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time of the slaying of Conrad Synthesis phone?
Yes, in addition to the other evidence that's true for all of the homicides, or most of them. In this instance, Mr. Dahmer explained that he was trying to create a zombie-like state for his victim so that he would have a compliant sexual partner, but that this did not go as he had planned. That is an indication that he was not behaving impulsively. That is, he had a plan that led to the drilling, nor did he have any compulsion to kill. His desire was to create this zombie-like state. When Mr. Dahmer was in the presence of the civilians and the police and fire personnel outside, and the victim was there, he was able to hear the police ask if anyone knew this man, Conrad Synthosymphones, and no one else there knew him. But then Mr. Dahmer identified himself, showed his ID, and took Conrad Synthosymphones back home with him in the company of the police. This meant that he had a problem on his hands. He had a young man on whom he'd performed a trephination procedure, a drilling into the skull. He had injected acid into the brain, and the police had seen him with this person. At that point, he has a dilemma in that if he were to allow Conrad Synthosymphones to live, he can be identified as a person with him during this incident. And the police have already been in the apartment and know where Jeffrey Dahmer, who gave the ID, lives. So now, his only available option is to either make the victim someone who's actually a zombie and can not tell on him and wouldn't be observed to be abnormal, or else he'll have to kill him and dispose of the body. He can't allow that body to remain intact because he'd be identified as the person who was with it. And Mr. Dahmer told me that after the police left, he gave a second injection of muriatic acid, and that proved fatal. But even then, he was attempting to carry out the plan to create a zombie. His words were, "Then I gave him the second injection of muriatic acid, and that was fatal. I didn't intend it to be, but it was." In other words, there was no compulsion to kill him. The death was the unintended consequence of doing this to the man. I asked later what really caused his death was the second dose, and he said, right. I asked him how long that had been after the police left, and he said it was about an hour. And I said, and your intent of injecting that at that point was what? And he said, to produce a zombie-like state. This indicates that Mr. Dahmer waited until out of the presence of the police before injecting an additional quantity of muriatic acid, which not only shows that he would have known it was wrong to ask their assistance in doing the injection, but also that he has the capacity to wait that additional amount of time before going forward with that particular procedure. I discussed further with him what his understanding would be of what would occur, since this wasn't the first time that he'd made such injections. And he said that he didn't know what would happen. Quote, I was still experimenting. I didn't know what. I was still trying to make it work. I asked if he took notes on any of this, because he'd used the word experimentation. He said no. And I said, you didn't fancy yourself a scientist? And he said no, which is an indication that that he knew what he was doing and wasn't operating under some belief that he was a mad scientist or a scientist actually making zombies. He was attempting to produce the sexual partners. Now, in all of the instances, that is, with respect to every killing, there are proximal witnesses, some laymen and some mental health professionals of various kinds who had contact with Mr. Dahmer before the killing and after the killing, sometimes in very close proximity, and who had occasion to make observations about his behavior. But in this particular case, there is, in addition, a set of witnesses who had occasion to observe Mr. Dahmer's behavior in the midst of what turned out to be the activities that led to the death, namely the 2 injections of acid into the brain. And the accounts of those witnesses are therefore informative of Mr. Dahmer's mental state at the time of that offense, because that's in the midst of the offense. And those witnesses saw no evidence of the signs or symptoms of any mental disorder that could cause one to lack substantial capacity to conform one's conduct to the requirements of the law, or to fail to appreciate the wrongfulness of one's conduct.
To put it in the form then, sir, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether or not, at the time of the slaying of Conrad Synthes, the defendant, Jeffrey Dahmer, possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law?
Yes, I did.
And what was that opinion?
In my opinion, Mr. Dahmer, at the time of killing Conrad Synthes, possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law.
Did you evaluate Jeffrey Dahmer's mental state as of the time that he slayed, engaged in first-degree intentional homicide of Matt Turner, that being on June 30, 1991?
Yes, I did.
Would you share with the jury your findings with respect to whether Mr. Dahmer appreciated or possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed Matt Turner?
In addition to Mr. Dahmer's statement that he appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct at the time of each of the killings, there is the evidence that Mr. Dahmer brought Mr. Turner to his home. In fact, brought him all the way from Chicago back to his apartment. And he told me that he'd paid for Mr. Turner's ticket. He took steps to avoid detection, which included what he referred to as defleshing and throwing the flesh out in the trash. At this time, he said he didn't have any more acid, and so he wasn't able to acidify the tissues, but rather had to put intact tissue out in the trash. And he also told me that at this time he had a 57-gallon barrel and reported that the other ones that he had leaked too much odor, and this one was sturdier. At whatever time he was concerned about the odor, that too would be an indication of his appreciation of the wrongfulness. So I think that was prior to bringing Mr. Turner back. He had meant, in addition, to dispose of certain other portions of the remains of Mr. Turner, but had run into a practical problem in that because a plastic bag containing some of the remains of Mr. Turner had frozen to the bottom of his freezer, and Mr. Dahmer said he was unable to remove that and meant to eventually thaw out the freezer so he could remove and dispose of those remains. And that desire to dispose of those remains is an indication of his appreciation of the wrongfulness.
As a result of your observations, and particularly your findings with respect to this death, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed Matt Turner?
Yes.
And what is that opinion?
In my opinion, at the time of his killing of Matt Turner, Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct.
And is that to a degree of medical certainty, a reasonable degree of medical certainty, that opinion?
Yes, it is.
Would you share with the jury your findings as to whether Jeffrey Dahmer possessed or lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time that he killed Matt Turner?
Well, Mr. Dahmer had met Mr. Turner in Chicago and, of course, did not undertake to kill him there, but rather bought him a bus ticket, brought him the whole way from Chicago to Milwaukee, and only when behind closed doors at his own apartment did Mr. Dahmer engage in his usual procedure of drugging the man's drink and then strangling him. That sequence of activities indicates that this is not an impulsive act because he is delaying gratification and behaving planfully and carrying out a predetermined plan. And in addition, the fact that Mr. Dahmer indicated that he never felt compelled to kill the men is an indication of his capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. Finally, there's the evidence that's common to the cases in general, in which Mr. Dahmer's indicated that had there been a witness, he would have refrained, and had the man agreed to remain with him voluntarily, he would have refrained.
Keeping in mind your observations and your findings with respect to this particular case, did you form an opinion within a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Jeffrey Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time that he slayed Matt Turner?
Yes.
And what is that opinion?
It's my opinion with reasonable medical certainty that at the time of killing Matt Turner, Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law.
Did you evaluate Jeffrey Dahmer's mental state as of the time that he engaged in the first-degree intentional homicide of Jeremiah Weinberger, that being on July 5, 1991?
Yes, I did.
Would you share with the jury your findings with respect to whether Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct when he slayed Jeremiah Weinberger?
In addition to the general features that are true for each case, here Mr. Dahmer also was concerned about disposal of the remains, though began to have difficulty. He said that he left the body in the bathtub with cold water and bleach so that it wouldn't start smelling. And that statement that he put bleach in the bathtub and left the water cold to prevent the odors that would arise from decomposition is an indication that Mr. Dahmer appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct because he was taking steps to prevent detection. I asked him whether the reason he had done that rather than the usual procedure was because he was running out of space. And he said that was so, but also he was running out of energy and didn't have the energy to do the so-called defleshing. So there were practical reasons for his varying the means by which he was disposing of the evidence. he confirmed that it was 5 or 6 days thereafter that he obtained the drum, the 57-gallon drum, for which the bill of lading showed a 7/12/91 purchase date. And obtaining that drum to assist him in disposing of the evidence is an additional indication of his appreciation of the wrongfulness of his conduct.
Was the drum partly selected, as far as you could determine from talking with Mr. Dahmer, that it would provide greater insurance against leakage of odors?
Exactly.
As a result of the observations you made of him, and particularly your findings with respect to this matter, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of professional certainty as to whether Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed Jeremiah Weinberger?
Yes.
And what did you conclude?
That at the time Mr. Dahmer killed Mr. Weinberger, Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct.
And was that to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, that opinion?
Yes.
Would you share with the jury your findings as to whether Jeffrey Dahmer possessed or lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time that he slayed Jeremiah Weinberger?
In addition to the evidence that's generally true, in this case in particular, these statements made by Mr. Dahmer, he said, after bringing Mr. Weinberger back, quote, "I make the drink, he falls asleep, drill, 1 injection, this time of boiling water, thinking it would be less corrosive than the muriatic acid. After a few hours, he wakes up, is semi-coherent, coherent enough that he knows who he is. He's not in a zombie-like state, so I give him more pills, give him a second injection. He goes into a coma. I go to work, come back the next morning, he's still alive. During the day, I try to get him to come around, try to get him to drink water. He never comes out of the coma. Go to work again another night, come back the next morning, and he's died by this time. I used boiling water with both injections this time, so that was a failure too." That description of what brought about the death of Mr. Weinberger shows that Mr. Dahmer was not acting under any compulsion to kill Mr. Weinberger, but rather was attempting to create for himself a compliant sexual partner. And in fact, the death was an unintended consequence, a byproduct of that effort to create a zombie. Also, the efforts he made to preserve the life of Mr. Weinberger in this state are an indication that he wasn't behaving impulsively at the time, but rather was behaving planfully and deliberately. I specifically asked about that by saying, "What did you do to try to revive him?" And Mr. Dahmer's response was, "Sat him up in the bed, tried to get him to drink some water, talked with him, moved his arms around. He was the only one that found him lying on the floor with his eyes wide open, and that struck me as very strange because the rest of them died with their eyes closed. They were wide open when I came back, so I don't know why that would be." The reason I share that passage is that it's an indication that Mr. Dahmer was surprised to find him dead, that is, didn't know that he would return to find him dead, that he didn't want him to die at that time. He wanted him to live and tried to get him to drink water. And this is an indication that Mr. Dahmer has no compulsion to kill.
From these observations and your findings on this particular count, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of professional medical certainty as to whether Mr. Dahmer possessed or lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time that Jeremiah Weinberger died?
Yes.
And what is that opinion?
That at the time of the actions that led to the death of Mr. Weinberger, it's my opinion with reasonable medical certainty that Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law.
Did you evaluate Jeffrey Dahmer's mental state as of the time that he as of the time of the first-degree intentional homicide of Oliver Lacey? That is, as of July 15, 1991.
Yes, I did.
Would you share with the jury your findings with respect to whether Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed Oliver Lacey?
Well, this, beginning with the killing of Oliver Lacey, there had been some changes in Mr. Dahmer's life. And specifically, he described how after killing Mr. Weinberger, he had changed his habits in some ways. I asked him why he hadn't taken the time to catch up with the disposal problem that he'd created for himself, because he had too much work to do to destroy evidence and was running into a problem here. And he said, getting sloppy for some reason, and things are falling apart. He also said that after killing Jeremiah Weinberger, but only after killing Jeremiah Weinberger, did he begin to drink even more than in the past. Whereas at the time of the other killings, in general, Mr. Dahmer had limited his drinking to weekends and had modulated the dose to achieve the desired effect. Here he began drinking in heavier doses. And so a number of events began to occur in rapid succession around the time of the last two killings with which Mr. Dahmer's charged that complicate the assessment of his mental state at the time of these offenses. I pointed out to him that the records indicated that on the 13th of July, 2 days before Mr. Lacey appears to have been killed, he had called into work with a phony excuse about his grandmother being sick. And he said that that was right, that he thinks he was with the next to the last victim at the time that he made that call to try to avoid getting into trouble at work. And I pointed out to him that his employer had said that he would have to bring proof that his grandmother was ill, like a note from the doctor, and that was a problem. And he admitted how that was a problem because he wasn't going to be able to find a doctor to certify that when it wasn't true. And he said, that's when I got fired. That's when I started drinking every day. So it is, as far as I can tell, at the time that he is with Oliver Lacey, and I don't know whether he has yet killed Oliver Lacey, when he calls to work. I gather, however, that he hadn't yet killed Oliver Lacey from the dates available to me, when he calls for work to try to get out of coming in. I pointed out to him, you really got your hands full there. You have an apartment full of bodies in various states, and you've been fired. And he said, right. I said, and you're out of money. He said, what happened? That's when things start falling apart. That spelled the end of things pretty much. I asked, so you began drinking even more? And he replied, every day after I lost the job. And with the second to last guy, did the drugging, strangling, no drilling, picture taking, dismembering, more picture taking. Well, that account that he first drugs the victim before strangling him is again an indication of his behaving as he had at the time of the earlier homicides, despite the greater number of stressors in his life. And likewise, he indicated that he initiated the process of disposing of the remains of Mr. Lacey by saying that he defleshed both Weinberger and Lacey at the same time. So the behaviors that I do know about with respect to the killing of Oliver Lacey are consistent with the behaviors at the time of the earlier incidents, in that he took the victim to a private location before killing him, suggesting a knowledge of an appreciation of wrongfulness, that he took steps to avoid detection, which has the same implication, and his general statement that he appreciated the wrongfulness at the time of all of the killings. But something is changing about the level of stress in Mr. Dahmer's life at this point.
From your observations and your findings in regard to this particular count, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed Oliver Lacey?
Well, from that information that I just gave alone, I wouldn't be able to, but based on everything that I know about the case and all of the other evidence that Mr. Dahmer subsequently told me about, I was able to form the opinion with reasonable medical certainty that at the time of killing Oliver Lacey, Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct.
Would you share with the jury your findings as to whether Jeffrey Dahmer possessed or lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time that he slayed Oliver Lacey?
The evidence there is merely the evidence that's common to all of the cases, with one exception, which is here, Mr. Dahmer's indicated that he's drinking heavily every day. And so although he told me in general that he drank to decrease his inhibitions at the time of the killing, it seems to me that there's independent evidence to suggest that he was drinking very heavily all the time for the few days between being fired and the time of his arrest. And so he may not have been drinking specifically to reduce inhibitions here, since he was drinking heavily more generally. Apart from that, however, the evidence indicates that he brought the victim back to a place where he could have him alone, that he didn't kill him immediately upon finding his physique desirable, but rather did so only after he had made his usual preparations of being alone with him and drugging him. And there are, of course, Mr. Dahmer's general statements that at the time of each of the killings he could have and would have refrained had there been a witness or had the victim agreed to stay voluntarily.
Keeping in mind your observations and those findings, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Jeffrey Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time that he slayed Oliver Lacey?
Considering all of the evidence, I formed the opinion with reasonable medical certainty that at the time of killing Oliver Lacey, Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law.
Did you evaluate Jeffrey Dahmer's mental state as of the time that he committed I'm sorry, sir.
I hadn't quite completed my last answer.
Forgive me.
I should have phrased it this way. I should have phrased the last answer that at the time of killing Oliver Lacey, there was no mental disease that would account for Mr. Dahmer lacking substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. However, there is a question in my mind as to whether his intoxication at that time may have played a different role than it did at the time of the other killings.
Right, then, could you tell us if you do have an opinion then with respect to whether or not whether he had the substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law?
Well, that's where there's some difficulty in forming a clear judgment. I am confident that there was no mental disease that impaired that capacity, but whether intoxication may have is another matter.
I see. And that would then,
If there was any impairment, it would have been due to intoxication.
and then that would be a matter of law for the court to instruct the jury as to the role of intoxication as a mental defense. Is that true?
Yes.
And there is specific instruction by the court addressing that issue. There will be. Did you evaluate Jeffrey Dahmer's mental state as of the time of the slaying of Joseph Bradehoft, that is, as of July 19, 1991? And that was
Yes.
a first-degree intentional homicide.
Yes, I did.
Would you share with the jury your findings with respect to whether Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct when he killed Joseph Bradehoft?
This, too, occurs at a time of unusual stress in Mr. Dahmer's life. And here I asked him, why did you neglect Bradehoft's body so long? And he replied, fatigue, excessive drinking during the week. He wasn't terribly attractive to me. I asked, but why not dispose of it? And he said, fatigue. I said, yeah, were you out of space too? And he said, no, I had space in the freezer. No, if I hadn't, that was my undoing. If I had not run across Tracy Edwards at the mall just before I was ready to leave, it would have been a very different ending. I would have acidified what I had in the drum, and I was debating on whether to keep the skulls that I had or to just acidify everything and get rid of all of the evidence, because I knew I had to be leaving the apartment within a week or two. So if I hadn't met him, I would have just gone back and disposed of the rest of the evidence, probably. That is an indication to me that Mr. Dahmer, at the time of killing Joseph Bradehoft, was aware of the conflict between disposing of evidence and being too tired to do so, and that he therefore appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct and was concerned about being detected. He went on to say, I was debating whether I should keep the skulls that were cleaned or whether I should just get rid of everything. I hadn't made up my mind yet, but I was definitely planning on acidifying the torsos that were in the blue drum. I asked, what were the two sides of the equation for you in keeping the skulls? In other words, to ask him if he's making a decision, how is he balancing this judgment? He replied, I wanted to keep them because it would have been a total waste otherwise. That was my thinking. I know it was risky since I didn't have any other place to live lined up or a job, so I hadn't decided. I asked, if you had kept them, how would you have stored them? And he said, in one of those rent-a-storage center places. Kept them in that metal filing cabinet that I had. It was lockable. I asked, and you had several in there? And he indicated he did. I asked if it would have held them all, and he said, no, I probably would have had to keep some in the freezer after defleshing. I asked, in the freezer, there was one bag that was internal organs. And he said, right, that was from the guy in Chicago bus station, namely Mr. Turner. The only reason that was left in there was because it had frozen to the bottom of the freezer, and if I tried to pull it out, it would have ripped the bag. I asked, and you would have liked to have gotten rid of that? And he replied, yeah. I asked, and how would you have gotten rid of that? And he said, I would have let it thaw out a bit and then pulled it out. So all of that goes to show that at the time of these events, Mr. Dahmer was concerned about disposing of evidence and getting rid of these remains, and debating about the possibility of needing to get rid of all of the remains, including the ones that had become mementos to him and that he'd rather have kept. And that indicates that even then, despite the increased stress and the drinking, he had an appreciation of the wrongfulness of his conduct.
Were you aware that he was laying in substantial quantities of muriatic acid at or about this time?
Yes. Well, he made repeated purchases.
And in terms of just the word lockable, when he told you he had a lockable metal cabinet, What does this, just simply the word lockable indicate?
He could lock it.
Pardon?
That he could lock it so that others wouldn't pry and see what was in there.
And conceal wrongdoing.
Yes.
Appreciate. The debate then was underway whether, did he anticipate being forced out because he had lost his job, forced out of the apartment building?
Because he couldn't pay the rent.
And then he was debating whether he was going to totally destroy, acidify the skulls and whatever else he had, all the evidence, at least the physical remains that he still possessed.
That's what he said.
And you drew inferences on his appreciation of the wrongfulness, because where would he be able to conceal this? If it came to light, there would be problems for him. Would that be accurate?
Yes, well, and I understand the conflict. This was a decision he had to face as to whether to destroy some of his favorite items and keepsakes, or take a very big risk of being detected for all of these serious crimes.
And he was weighing that and fully appreciative of what appeared to be the risk involved.
Yes.
And it was on those observations and your earlier observations and those findings, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of professional certainty as to whether at the time that the defendant slayed Joseph Bredehoff, he had the substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct?
Yes.
And what was that opinion?
In my opinion, at the time of killing Joseph Bredehoff, Mr. Dahmer possessed substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct.
Would you share with the jury your findings as to whether Jeffrey Dahmer possessed or lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time of the slaying of Joseph Bredehoff?
Well, Mr. Dahmer described the events by saying, that was about a week after I'd lost the job. Drinking every day, was drinking in the afternoon, was on my way to the Grand Mall, saw him waiting at the bus stop, got off the bus, offered him money to go back to the apartment. Same scenario. He agreed. We did some drinking there of beer. Then I gave him the sleeping potion, and he fell asleep. We had light sex before that, and strangulation. I didn't take any pictures. I didn't have any film at the time, and so I just left him lying there on the bed, covered him over with a sheet, and left him there for 2 days. That sequence of events indicates that, as in the other cases, Mr. Dahmer had brought the victim back to where he had him privately. It indicates that he was not behaving impulsively in the killing, but rather only after bringing the victim into this private setting where he could do so in the absence of witnesses. It indicates that he made the advanced preparation of rendering his victim unconscious with the drugging before engaging in the strangulation, which also shows that it's not an impulsive act. Mr. Dahmer has made plain in his other statements and in his behavior generally that he doesn't experience a compulsion to kill. But in this instance, just as in the case of Mr. Lacey, the fact that Mr. Dahmer is drinking heavily each day, as he reports, means that he may not have, in fact, consumed alcohol specifically to decrease his inhibitions against killing. He may already have consumed enough alcohol to decrease those inhibitions without drinking extra to achieve the goal. And so that piece of evidence does not appear to be present here as it is with the others. And then, of course, Mr. Dahmer made the more general statement that at the time of each of these 15 killings, had the victim agreed voluntarily to stay with him, he would have refrained. Had a witness entered, he would have refrained.
As a result of your observations, and particularly your findings with respect to this count, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether the defendant possessed substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time that he killed Joseph Bredehoft.
As in the case of Mr. Lacey, I think the most accurate way I can phrase this is that it's my opinion with reasonable medical certainty that there is no mental disease that caused Mr. Dahmer at the time of killing Joseph Bredehoft to lack substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. But I cannot, from the facts that I've given so far, rule out the possibility that alcohol intoxication may have impaired his capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law.
And that would be, again, a matter for the court to instruct on the issue of intoxication. That completed your review with respect to the 15 particular individual slayings that were the counts in the information. Is that correct?
That's correct.
There's additional information you're going to share with the jury, but I'd like to go back a bit. This might be a natural time to break, I'm not sure, because we're going to...
Well, if you want to at this time, we could do that.
Fine, then I would suggest that we break.
Okay. Before we do break, though, there's one thing that the court would like to address. Wir haben ein Geburtstagskind. We have a birthday child. This birthday child has reached the age of 65 years. Now, that's not quite as old, or I should say that's a little older than the court because, sir, you got me beat by 5 years and 5 days. I hit 60 on Monday. But, as serious as this trial is, as important it is, life does go on, and that includes birthdays. And I am sure that this birthday child would, as much as he may enjoy the companionship of his fellow jurors and bailiffs, would really prefer to be with some of his family members on his 65th birthday. But unfortunately, that's not possible. It's a poor substitute, sir. But on behalf of myself, on behalf of the court staff, and all of the participants in this trial, a very happy birthday, sir, and we look forward